Welcome to Medicated Housewife DIY. In today's DIY video, top 10 tumbling tower block crafts from the past. Dollar Tree Jenga Block home decor on a budget. We are looking at your top 10 Dollar Tree tumbling tower block or Jenga block DIYs from the past. Some of your favorite DIY projects over the past year or so. These are beautiful, high-end home decor DIYs that anyone can make and on a budget too. It doesn't get any better than that. So stick around and let's go make some stuff and jump right into this. For DIY number 1, to begin with, I'm using 68 tumbling tower blocks from this box of 72 from Dollar Tree, and we're using Titebond Quick and Thick wood glue, which I will link for you in the description box below, along with all the non-Dollar Tree supplies used in all these DIYs. We're making 8 rows with these blocks, and you're going to want to alternate each row with one row being 11 blocks stacked right on top of each other, and the next row being 6 blocks attached side to side, as you can see me do here for all 8 rows. And we're gluing all the rows to each other until all 8 rows are complete and we have this nice big square block of wood. I grabbed some Minwax wood filler, and at first I was only trying to fill in the larger gaping holes at the top of the wood square, but I eventually decided to use the wood filler to fill in all the sides of the block to make it a little more solid wood looking, and I did my best to wipe away as much excess filler as I could before allowing that square to dry. Once dried, I used a Dollar Tree sanding block to sand off the excess lumps of filler and make the square a smooth wood block. I got these small wood cones on Amazon, and I'll link them for you below, but they were not the exact shape that I had wanted. So I used a miter shears first, and I also used regular scissors to snip the bottom point off of each of them so that I could make them a little bit more flat at the bottom, and then I could use them, I used the cones as legs. I'm using Varathane wood stain in the color Ipswich Pine, which I will link for you below. First staining the legs and then staining the entire wood square the same color on all of the sides, and I used a dry paper towel to wipe off any excess stain as I went along, and then allowed all the pieces to fully dry. Once dry, I used the Quick and Thick to glue the 4 legs to the bottom of my square. And this is the first of 2 tumbling tower block wood risers for this DIY. I loved the natural wood color of this riser, and it reminds me of a butcher block, which I love, and it has a very clean, spa-like or Scandinavian kind of vibe to it. Great for displaying candles or small plants, just a lovely high-end looking piece of decor. With the second part of this DIY, I was able to use all those extra multicolored stained blocks I had saved from other projects. We're doing this the exact same way as the first one. We're using 68 blocks, and I made 8 rows of alternating 11 and 6 blocks in each row. I had picked out 6 or 7 different colors of blocks that I already had to use, which was great to use up all those discarded blocks that I just had lying around. And I only used the stained blocks, not the painted one, because I still wanted the wood grain to show through on all of them. I also skipped the wood filler this time because I really didn't feel it added that much to the overall look of the final square. Off camera, I had stained these wood cones with Varathane Golden Oak, but it felt too dark to me, so I sanded them and used a combination of white chalk paint and water to give them a light whitewash over the stain and brighten them up a bit. Then I simply glued the 4 legs to the bottom of the wood square. And this is the second part of DIY number 1. I did give it a light coat of outdoor Mod Podge to seal it, but I really loved the way this came out. I loved it every bit as much as the first riser, and what a bonus to use discarded blocks, a true trash to treasure in my opinion, and a really gorgeous piece of home decor. DIY number 2 begins with 1.5 boxes of Dollar Tree tumbling tower blocks, and that's the 72 pack of blocks. So we used about 1.5 boxes of the blocks, stained all of them with Varathane wood stain in the color Early American, and for this project we're using Gorilla Glue wood glue. So the first thing I did was stain all of my blocks, and I did stain a few extra just in case. Once the stain dried, I glued all the blocks in groups of 2, one on top of the other, just like a sandwich. Once the sets of 2 had dried, I started assembling the shape from my bowl, and yes, we're making a Jenga block bowl. The first row is going to be the widest row, and it's also the middle, so we are starting to work from the middle of the bowl, and I used 7 of the 2 block sets with the wide side facing upward toward me, and I use some wood cubes, from Dollar Tree as spacers. They're only spacers, they're not going to be part of the project. We just want to use them to make the spaces between our first row of blocks as even as possible. And starting on our second row, we are gluing our block sets in between the 2 blocks beneath it. And the second row of blocks is also slightly staggered, as in it is glued about halfway up the blocks under it. And I know that that sounds complicated, but you can see as you watch me that it is not. We are only using 6 blocks in row number 2. Each one placed between 2 blocks under it and slightly upwards from the blocks that are under it. So row number 1 was 7 blocks, and this row number 2 is 6 blocks. Starting on row number 3, we are still gluing each block in the space in between the 2 blocks under it and still placing it slightly upward on top of those blocks underneath. This row number 3 is only going to be 5 blocks. So if you're keeping track, row number 1 was 7 blocks, row number 2 was 6 blocks, this row number 3 is 5 blocks, and I think you can figure out the pattern here. Each consecutive row has 1 less block. So that means that row number 4 is only 4 blocks across. So row number 5 is only going to be 3 blocks across. And as I'm sure you can guess, row number 6 is 2 blocks. And then your final row is row number 7, and that has 1 block, and this completes the first side of the bowl. I allowed the first side to dry overnight and then flip it over, so we are back at our first row of 7 blocks, which if you remember is the middle of our bowl. We are starting the second half of the bowl in the middle of the bowl, which I have rested on a little stand I made out of tumbling tower block boxes to support it as we work without putting any stress on that one little single block on the bottom of that side. And since that row we are starting with was 7 blocks, this next row will be 6 blocks, and now we are staggering them forward a little upward on the blocks beneath it toward us to keep that bowl shape forming, and hopefully that makes sense to you. This third row is going to be 5 blocks. That's 1 less block than what we just did, just like we did with the first side of the bowl. Then 4 blocks, keeping the same pattern. And then we're down to 3 blocks. Then 2 blocks. And then finally the last row with 1 block. I had some extra 2 block sets left over, and I wanted to give the bowl a little height, so I took 2 of those 2 block sets and glued them right in the middle of the bottom of my bowl as feet for the bowl. And this is DIY number 2, my Jenga block bowl. This was one of my earlier projects and one of my most popular videos, and I still love it and display it today. I think it's so classic and so versatile and very stylish, a high-end looking decor piece that's timeless in my opinion. For DIY number 3, we are making 2 different versions of a tumbling tower block lamp. Each lamp uses a total of 80 blocks. For the first lamp, we're using 80 of these coffee-stained blocks, and I will dive deeper into coffee staining later in the video. Using the 80 blocks, we're going to glue 40 sets of 2 blocks glued end to end, and I'm using Gorilla Hot Glue to attach them. Once I have my 40 sets of 2, I'm using 4 of each to make 10 squares total. The blocks are standing on their sides as I assemble them into squares. I wanted the 10 squares to be a little bit of a deeper brown, so I dry brushed some antique wax on them to deepen the color. Then I mixed some white chalk paint with a tiny bit of antique wax to make a beigey kind of a color, and used another dry brush to sparingly brush some of that beigey color on just to give the squares a distressed look. Using 6 jumbo craft sticks, I hot glued 2 more craft sticks on top of them to keep them together, and I trimmed the ends off carefully with a scissors. Then I just traced the same size as my Jenga block squares with a pencil and trimmed the craft sticks into the same size squares as my Jenga block squares, and this is going to be the bottom of my lamp. Off camera, I had painted the craft stick square with antique wax and then used the same chalk paint and antique wax mixture to distress the bottom to match the Jenga block squares. To assemble the first lamp, I use wood glue to glue the first square directly down onto the craft stick bottom. Then each square after that attaches slightly askew to the square under it, and I just make the corners go slightly ahead of each corner that's under it, which is hard to explain and sounds complicated, but watching it makes it a lot clearer. I just line them up a little bit to the side of the previous square under it, trying my best not to have any big gaping holes in between each of those squares until all 10 squares are glued down. And this is the first of my 2 Jenga block lamp DIYs. I placed a Dollar Tree push or a puck light into the bottom, and I think this cute little lamp is so rustic and farmhouse charming. The light is great as a night light or an accent light, but not strong enough for reading. It's just a beautiful decor light. The second part of this DIY is assembled the same as the first. This time we're using unstained tumbling tower blocks, 80 of them, glued into 40 sets of 2 blocks. And then 4 of each set of 2 is assembled into 10 squares. I'm using Folk Art Treasure Gold acrylic paint to paint only the inside of each of the squares. And I did use 2 coats to get an opaque gold color. Then on the outside of each of my squares, I gave them all a generous coat of antique wax because I wanted a really dark and rich brown color on the outside of all of my squares. I made a second craft stick bottom the same as the first and painted this one with the same Folk Art Treasure Gold paint as the inside of my squares. Then using wood glue, I glued the first square down directly onto the gold craft stick bottom and assembled the rest of the squares the same as the first lamp that was assembled, all slightly askew to the square that's under it, up into the last of the 10 squares. And I added a Dollar Tree push light to the bottom. And this is the second lamp of DIY number 3, and I just loved the richness of this lamp. The dark wood and gold combo makes this kind of modern and regal, in my opinion, and the warm, subtle light that comes from it just really sets a mood in a room. These are 2 lamps in 2 different styles, both beautiful in their own way. DIY number 4 has 3 different versions of tumbling tower hearts just in time for Valentine's Day. To begin with, I Google searched a free heart template printable, and I got this multi-sized heart sheet that I printed. I am using the 5-inch heart as a template, and I'm using some unpainted Jenga blocks standing up to essentially trace the heart shape with the blocks, as you see me doing right here. And then using some Dollar Tree wood glue to attach those blocks together in that formation. Once the glue dried, I used white chalk paint and a dry brush to lightly paint the heart white so that lots of that wood still showed through. When the white dried, I used some Folk Art acrylic paint in the color Seashell and another dry brush to lightly add some of that pink color on top of the white chalk paint. I really just wanted a little hint of pink tone. I used my Jenga block heart as a template and I traced it onto a piece of white foam board, then used an X-Acto knife to cut that heart out. And this is going to be the bottom of my Jenga block heart. I grabbed a small piece of Dollar Tree burlap ribbon and folded it over onto itself to make a loop and glued the ends down onto the white foam board because that part will be hidden in the finished project. Then I used some hot glue to attach that foam board bottom to the Jenga block heart. I had a bunch of these pink roses from Dollar Tree, and full disclosure, I did not want to use this color pink in the roses. I really wanted a much light color pink, but of course, this was the only pink rose available at my Dollar Tree that day, so I had to make do. I used a wire cutter to snip the buds off all the rose bunches, and I also ended up having to then re-snip them all afterwards, a lot closer to the bud in order for the flowers to stand up in the heart. Then I used some hot glue to attach the rose buds to the bottom of the heart. I needed something that said love, so I dug deep in my hoarder's basement and found these love charms I've had probably since 2012 when I used to make a lot of bracelets. So I snipped the loops off of the love charm and then I hot glued it to some of those spare rose leaves that I had left over. And this is the first of my 3 Jenga Block hearts from DIY number 4. I did end up wrapping a pink ribbon around the outside of the heart, and I think this heart is really cute in a traditional Valentine, I Love Lucy kind of way. The second heart in DIY number 4 starts with some coffee stained Jenga blocks traced around that 5-inch heart template again. And again, we use wood glue to attach the blocks together in that formation. We traced and cut out that heart out of foam board. Then, using antique wax, I painted the foam board heart, making sure to get the edges of the foam board too, because that is always a dead giveaway when you can see those foam board edges. I couldn't get my hands on any of that faux leather ribbon at Dollar Tree that you all love so much, because yeah, that's my Dollar Tree. I got this faux leather tape at Amazon and I'll link it for you below. It's kind of like duct tape, so I cut some strips and I folded the edges over so that it would look a little bit more leather band-like, and I used some hot glue to wrap my faux leather band around the outside of the heart. Meanwhile, I had made a loop out of that leather tape and I had hot glued the foam board backing to the heart. I grabbed some Dollar Tree moss and hot glued that to the inside of the heart as well. And at that point, I added a few succulents on top of the moss. And this is the second heart in DIY number 4. This totally reminds me of one of those decorative wood barrels, but I love it in a rustic heart kind of way. The final heart in DIY number 4 is larger, using a 6-inch heart template, and we're using more of those coffee stained Jenga blocks, but this time I traced the heart with the blocks stacked in front of one another instead of just side to side, and this makes the heart a little bit more substantial. I used the same Dollar Tree wood glue to attach all of those blocks together in that heart formation. I added some hot glue to the bottom of the heart to give it even more stability. Then I glued 8 of the coffee stained blocks side by side on a jumbo craft stick and trimmed the stick because we're going to use that to make a little mini shelf inside of our heart. I used some wood glue to attach the mini shelf inside the heart and added a couple of extra blocks on the ends just to hide the seams between the shelf and the heart. And this is the third heart from DIY number 4. Now this shelf is not super strong, but it can hold a small candle or flower or something like that. And I love its spa-like clean look. DIY number 5 is a very large tumbling tower block platter. We're using 158 tumbling tower blocks, and that's 2 boxes of 72 plus an extra 14. I've got the blocks spread out with some cubes as spacers only. They are not part of the design. This first row, which will eventually be the middle of our platter, has 7 blocks across, and we are shaping this platter to raise up just a little, just very slightly, on both ends of the rows. We're using Dollar Tree wood glue, and we add row number 2 on top of row number 1. And row number 2 has 6 blocks, and they are placed in the space between the 2 blocks beneath it. So row number 1 is 7 blocks across, and row number 2 is 6 blocks. Row number 3 is going to be 7 blocks again, and there is a pattern to this, I promise. Now when we get to the ends, we need to put a spacer of some sort under those end blocks to hold them up while the glue dries, because there is just nothing under there. I listed the number of blocks in each row on this first side of the platter on the left side of your screen, and if you're making this platter, I suggest you pause this screen to make a note for yourself of how many blocks are in each row. In the interest of time, I'm going to speed this up, and row number 4 is going to be 6 blocks, row number 5 is going to be 5 blocks, and row number 6 is going to be 6 blocks. Then row number 7 is 5 blocks. And remember, we are basically going straight across the row except for a slight upturn on the ends of the row to give the platter its shape. Row number 8 is 4 blocks, and row number 9 is 5 blocks. Row number 10 is 4 blocks. Row number 11 is 3 blocks. Row number 12 is 4 blocks, and remember, all of these row numbers and blocks are listed on your screen. Beginning here with row number 13, which is 3 blocks, now we are going to start angling those blocks slightly upward on the whole row, and each block is just about halfway in toward the middle of the blocks that are beneath it. You can see what I'm doing here. This is going to create a slight rounded shape to the ends of our platter. We're going to keep that angling upward on all the remaining rows on this side of the platter. So row 14 is 2 blocks, row 15 is 3 blocks, row 16 is 2 blocks, and row 17, which is the final row on this side, is going to be only 1 block. After letting the first side of the platter dry overnight, I turned it upside down and I set up some tumbling tower block boxes to support the platter standing upright. We are starting at the middle point, which is, if you remember, 7 blocks across. But for simplicity, we are referring to this next row we are about to do now as row number 1, and row number 1 is 6 blocks across. I have put the list of row numbers and number of blocks for the second half of this platter in yellow for you on the left side of your screen if you want to pause it. So for the next couple of minutes, while I finish the rest of the rows for this second side, you can follow along with the list of rows on your left. Also watch me almost lose the entire project as it almost toppled over twice while I was filming this, because this is real life crafting, guys. Once I get to the final row, which is row number 16, and it is 1 block, I allowed the entire platter to dry for several hours before continuing. I decided to make some legs to go underneath my platter and to give it some height. So I made 2 sets of 6 blocks, as you can see here. And then I stained the legs and the entire platter, both front, back, sides, and inside edges, with Varathane wood stain in the color Early American. And this is DIY number 5, my tumbling tower block platter. This thing is massive, you guys, but I love it. I love it. I still have this on my dining table today, like a year after I made it. It's gorgeous. DIY number 6 is 3 different variations of Jenga Block coasters, and this first coaster is also kind of a trivet, depending on how you use it. We start with 25 coffee stain tumbling tower blocks, and I can't really describe the pattern easily, but it begins with 2 H's, and then you can pause this video to copy the design block by block. That's just the easiest way for you to be able to do this. I am using Titebond wood glue to attach the 25 blocks together. Once the glue dries, I gave them a quick light coat of antique wax to deepen that overall brown color. Then, using folk art acrylic paint in the color Camel, I sparingly dry brush some of that beigey color to give that trivet or coaster a distressed look. And this is the first coaster slash trivet from DIY number 6, and I have to say I fell in love with this simple woven pattern, and honestly, I would like to incorporate this pattern into a future project for sure. The second coaster in DIY number 6 uses 24 blocks for each coaster, and we are making a pair of them. We start with gluing all 24 into groups of 2, glued sandwich style, which is one on top of the other, and we're using Titebond wood glue. Then we take our sandwich style groups of 2 blocks and glue them together into groups of 3 to make thick little squares. We glue 4 of the 3 block squares together to make an even bigger, thick square. I make a second matching square, and then I stain both coasters with Minwax wood stain in the color Jacobean, giving them a really deep brown color. Next, I had these wood half beads from Amazon, and I will link them for you below. I needed 20 beads per coaster, so that's 40 beads total. I put them on pieces of packing tape to keep them in place while I paint them. And first, I painted them all with one coat of white chalk paint. Then once that white chalk paint had dried, I painted them with Folk Art Treasure Gold. And they kind of all look like button candy, don't they? Once the gold half beads had dried, I used some wood glue to glue 5 beads on each of the 4 sides of the coasters, spacing them out evenly. And this is the second Jenga Block coaster of DIY number 6. I think these are very stately and regal looking, maybe even a little medieval, but so easy and so unique. For the third set of coasters in DIY number 6, we are making groups of 3 blocks glued side to side and then gluing 4 of them together to make a square. We're using a total of 12 blocks for each of the 2 coasters, and I'm using Quick and Thick to glue them together. I'm painting both coasters with antique wax on the front, back, and the sides. I made a striped template out of painter's tape and a ruler. I cut out stripes with an X-Acto knife, 1 large stripe that was about a ½ inch wide and 2 smaller stripes about a ¼ inch wide. Painted the large stripe with Folk Art Treasure Gold, but ended up repainting the stripe off camera with Folk Art Camel because I didn't like the gold at all. And I painted those small stripes with white chalk paint. And to be totally honest, my stripes were a hot mess and I almost scrapped this whole project, but I thought, why not let you see my mistakes? So not my favorite. And here's the third set of coasters from DIY number 6. Again, not my favorite, but not everyone hates them. So I've got that going for me. Ugh, let's move on, shall we? For DIY number 7, we're making Jenga Block soap dishes. We're using a box of tumbling tower blocks and Titebond Quick and Thick wood glue. And for the first 2 soap dishes, we are gluing together 12 rows of 3 blocks, and then we're going to glue together 7 rows of 2 blocks. So for the 12 rows of 3 blocks, I glue the second row to the bottom row kind of diagonally, and what I mean by that is that the bottom corner of the top row is meeting the top corner of the bottom row, and then on the other side, my top corner of my top row is meeting with the bottom corner of the bottom row, kind of crisscross, just like you see me do here, and I'm going to freeze frame it so you can really see it. And then we do the opposite with the next row of 3 and alternate each row after that, just making one crisscross after another. And I really hope that makes more sense to you by you seeing it. Then we take our 7 rows of 2 blocks and we are going to do the exact same crisscross, but this time our blocks are on their sides with the thin side facing up at us. So it is the same corner to opposite corner, alternating each row so that they all crisscross each other. I'm using Zizner Bullseye Shellac in the color Amber on both of these first 2 soap dishes, and I use a light coat because this stuff gets pretty sticky if you use too much of it. Also, I need to say that the video is making the shellac look a lot more yellow than it actually is. In real life, the color is much more subtle. And these are the first 2 soap dishes of DIY number 7, and I forgot to say I glued 4 wood cubes to the bottom of the larger dish to give it some height, and I love these soap dishes in a kitchen or in a bathroom setting. For the 3rd, 4th, and 5th soap dishes of DIY number 7, we are using all rows of 2 blocks glued end to end using Titebond Quick and Thick wood glue. I'm gluing 6 rows of 2 together side to side, then I'm taking 5 more rows of 2 and gluing each one on its side directly on the 5 seams of the 6 rows that are beneath it. Then I glue 7 rows of 2 together side by side and take 4 more rows of 2 and I'm gluing 1 on every other row that's beneath it. And the flat side is facing up on that row on top of the bottom row. Next, I take 7 more rows of 2 and I'm going to alternate them. Flat side down, then narrow side down, then flat side, then narrow side. I stain all 3 of the soap dishes with the Zizner Amber Shellac. And this is soap dishes number 3, 4, and 5 of DIY number 7. Such simplicity, but somehow they just work and they just look so good. I love these. The 6th soap dish on DIY number 7 is also using 2 block sets of blocks glued end to end. And to begin with, I'm using Titebond Quick and Thick Wood Glue, and I'm gluing 1 2-block set on top of another set with the thin side facing up. Next, I take 5 more sets of 2 blocks and we're going to glue them thin side up on one end to the top of our 4-block set that we just glued, like I'm doing here. I space out those 5 2-block sets evenly across. Then I take another 2-block set and I glue that thin side up right up against the other sides of those 5 sets we just glued. I use 2 more 2-block sets. One gets glued to the bottom end of our 5 sets and the other gets glued to that top part of those 5 sets, like you see here, and that's to reinforce everything in place. Lastly, I stain the entire soap dish with Varathane stain in Ipswich Pine to seal it. And this is the 6th soap dish from DIY number 7, and I love this dish so much. I have it in my kitchen today, holding my sponge. It's awesome. I will say that you must use enough glue and some waterproof sealer if you want this dish to last long-term for everyday use, but it's totally worth it. DIY number 8 is my tumbling tower block hanging bowl, and this bowl uses about 190 tumbling tower blocks, give or take a few. I'm coffee staining them here, which is simply letting them soak in very hot water mixed with a ton of cheap instant coffee for several hours, then letting them dry. They turn a beautiful, deep, warm brown, and they smell great. And that's if you like the smell of coffee, which I do. Once the blocks are totally dry, I grab an 11-inch bowl to use as a circle template to set up my blocks. And I'm starting this with 13 Jenga blocks, and we're going to space out those blocks as evenly as possible around that bowl. That first row of spaced blocks is row number 1, and technically it will be the middle of our finished bowl, so we're starting in the middle. And this second row of blocks is also 13 blocks. And we are going to use Dollar Tree wood glue to glue each of those 13 blocks in the second row to cover the spaces between the 2 blocks beneath it, as you can see me doing right here. Row number 3 is also 13 blocks around, and it is done exactly the same way as we did row number 2. Beginning on this 4th row, instead of 13 blocks, we're using 12 blocks, and I start adding the 12 blocks, leaving a space in the very middle of the top of that circle, and that's going to be the very top of our hanging bowl. Hopefully that makes sense to you. Each row after this one is going to have 1 less block than the row before it. Next is the 5th row. It's 11 blocks, and it's also where we start to stagger the blocks about halfway up in the middle of the blocks that are beneath it, like you see me doing here. And all the following rows will be placed just a little upwards to help form the shape of our bowl. The 6th row is 10 blocks, and we're still staggering them upwards and keeping the top part of the bowl in the middle while we work. And speeding this up, the 7th row is 9 blocks, the 8th row is 8 blocks, 9th row is 7 blocks, 10th row is 6 blocks, 11th row is 5 blocks, 12th row is 4 blocks, and the 13th row is our final row for this side, and it's going to be 3 blocks. We let that dry overnight, and then using the orange bowl to support this half of our bowl, we are going to basically repeat side 1 on this side, but we're going to start with our row number 1 being 12 blocks. So our second row is 11 blocks. We're also going to begin staggering those blocks halfway up to create our bowl shape. all the rows after this are still going to continue with that slight stagger upwards, about halfway up the block underneath it. Now, row 3 is going to be 10 blocks, row 4 is going to be 9 blocks, row 5 is 8 blocks, row 6 is 7 blocks, row 8 is 6 blocks, row 9 is 5 blocks, row 10 is 4 blocks, and row number 11 is our final row, and that's going to have 3 blocks. And I didn't show it on camera, but I did make a pair of feet for the bottom of the bowl, gluing 2 sets of 2 sandwiched blocks to the middle of the bottom of the bowl. And this is DIY number 8, my Jenga Block hanging bowl. And I think this bowl is so impressive looking, and I always get compliments on it when people see it in my home. Just a really unique way to use tumbling tower blocks as upscale home decor. DIY number 9 is a tumbling tower block riser / tray done 3 different ways. We're using Dollar Tree Jenga blocks and Dollar Tree wood cubes. I'm using 72 blocks to create each of these trays, so that's 1 box of blocks per tray. I used 3 boxes total. First, we make 12 rows of 6 Jenga blocks glued end to end with Dollar Tree wood glue. When the 12 rows of 6 had dried, I used some leftover instant coffee like a stain and stained all 12 rows of blocks with the coffee. When the coffee stain had dried, I grabbed 24 Dollar Tree wood cubes and used my wood glue to glue a cube on the end and then in between each of the 12 rows of blocks with their narrow side facing upwards. I do 1 cube on each of the 12 rows of blocks on both ends, as you can see me do here, and I left about 1 cube's worth of space on both of the ends of each row. Now, full disclosure, I actually ended up dropping this tray and it broke apart, so I glued one side on top of the other, added 4 cubes on the bottom to use as feet, and this is what happened. I still think this tray, which is now a riser, looks really nice. Even though it's not the original plan, this is just a reminder that sometimes accidents can work out anyway. Just some important life lessons from me to you. This second riser tray of DIY number 9 also starts with 12 rows of 6 Jenga blocks glued end to end. I am staining all of them with Zizner Bullseye Shellac in the color Amber. I also grabbed about 30 wood cubes and I stained them with that same Amber shellac and allowed all of that to fully dry. I glued the cubes to the rows of blocks the same way as the riser tray that we did earlier. I'm using a wood cube in between each row, but this time I got a little bit smarter and used a bit more glue to make it stronger. I also used those same wood cubes as spacers at the end of each row to make it easier for me to be sure that my cubes were all spaced evenly and correctly in between each of my rows. At the end, I used 4 more stained cubes on the 4 corners of this tray to use as feet and to give it some height. And this is the second riser tray of DIY number 9, and I was very happy with how this tray turned out. It's simple, it's a little spa-like or Scandinavian maybe, and it looks perfect in a bathroom with some hand towels or candles or something like that. Just very simple, very elegant. The third tray is also 12 rows of 6 blocks glued end to end, but this time we painted the rows and the wood cubes with some antique wax. And once again, we glued a cube on each end and a cube in between each of our rows using some wood glue. And lastly, I grabbed 4 more cubes to glue on the 4 corners of the tray to give it some height. And this is the third riser tray in DIY number 9, and yes, it is exactly the same tray as the one before this, but it's a different color, and because of that, it really has a different look, in my opinion. This one is perfect as a plant stand, and it has a much more rustic feel to it. DIY number 10 is a tumbling tower block planter, and it is really, really unique and really large. This planter uses 296 tumbling tower blocks, which is just over 4 boxes of the 72 block box size, and it's really big, you guys. Using Titebond wood glue, we're going to be gluing all 296 blocks into sets of 2 blocks. They're glued end to end, and that works out to be 148 sets of 2 blocks each. Next, we're going to take one of our 2-block rows and we're going to glue it on top of another 2-block row, flat side up, so it's sandwich style. And we're going to be doing that to all 148 2-block rows, which leaves us with 74 sets of 4 blocks. Now we have 74 sets of 4 blocks each, which we will now just refer to as sets. To make our first row, we are taking 2 sets of blocks and simply gluing them together end to end. And just so you know, this planter is made up of 37 rows, so this thing is massive. I also want to mention that you will be using a lot of spare Jenga blocks to use as spacers as we build our planter, because wood glue does not set up immediately, so we need to place spacer blocks under the rows we are making to support them as they dry. On row number 2, we are starting to place our sets next to the previous row, but also slightly elevated, just a little bit upwards from that first row, as you can see here. We do that on both sides of this row, and as you can see, we start using those spacer blocks right away to support row number 2. The second set of row number 2 follows the same line as the other side did. We're slightly elevated above row number 1, but it should match the opposite side of its same row, if that makes any sense. This can be hard to explain, but once you understand the goal we have by making the design that we're making, it will be a lot clearer to you, I promise. Row number 3 follows the same pattern as row number 2, so both sets of blocks in row number 3 are slightly higher than row number 2, and we use as many spacer blocks as we need piled on top of each other to support each consecutive row as it dries. And row number 4 is more of the same. It's slightly higher than row number 3. I do allow some extra drying time every 4 or 5 rows to make it a little easier to continue building. Row number 5 is more of the same and slightly higher than row number 4. Row number 6, we're still going slightly higher than row number 5. We've built ourselves quite the tower of spacer blocks to support our rows, and we keep getting higher with row number 7. Row number 8, and we're still climbing higher. On row number 9, we are almost standing straight up, but not quite. On row number 10, we have both sides of the row standing pretty much straight up and down, and I want to make a note here to remind you that we are keeping our edges of all the rows in line as much as possible as we place each row of blocks. Our next row begins our descent from straight up and down to back downwards again. So each of our consecutive rows after this will get lower and lower than its previous row before it, until we have reached the bottom again and we have a nice flat row. And now our piles of spacer blocks also move to the outside of the planter to support each of those sides as we work on them and as we build the planter. At this point, we have a pretty flat row, and that's when we can begin raising those rows up again. And I think you can see the pattern that we're doing here. I like to think of it as the Jenga block version of the wave, you know, like at a stadium, a sports stadium or something like that. So each of our rows start to get a little higher until we reach that point where the rows are again straight up and down. Once our rows are straight up and down, at that point, you guessed it, we are starting our descent downwards again, and we are going to row by row get lower and lower until our last row, which is totally flat and closed together so that it matches row number 1 at the beginning. Now, truth be told, I was a little nervous that my final row was not going to be in the right position, so I started the last row separately on its own by gluing 2 sets together end to end, and then adding the next 3 rows to it, gradually getting slightly higher in each row before I attached that last 4-row piece to the rest of the planter. And with that, all 37 rows were completed. Then I stained the entire piece, all 37 rows, top, bottom, inside, and out with Varathane Early American wood stain, and I allowed that to fully dry. I mixed some white chalk paint with antique wax, and using a dry rough brush, I used the paint sparingly to create a distressed kind of look on all the sides of the planter. Meanwhile, off camera, I had cut a piece of white foam board from Dollar Tree to fit the bottom of the planter, and I painted it fully with some antique wax, making sure to paint the edges too of the foam board so that they wouldn't be noticeable. Then I distressed the same foam board with that chalk paint and antique wax mixture to make it look like wood, and I used some hot glue off camera to attach the planter to the foam board so that it had a bottom. And this is DIY number 10, my Jenga Block wood planter, and I cannot tell you how much I love this decor piece. I think it's gorgeous, so high-end, and one of the most unique looking things that I personally have ever seen made out of tumbling tower blocks. I still get compliments on this today, and I still use it as a centerpiece on my dining room table. It's rustic, and it's just plain stunning. And I hope you guys think so too. And these are my top 10 tumbling tower block crafts from the past, some of my favorites, and hopefully some of yours. Let me know in the comments which one was your favorite. I love hearing from you. And because you are still here with me, I want to take a moment to say thank you so much for being here and for watching. Your support means everything to me. I couldn't do this without you, and I appreciate all of you. If you've enjoyed any of these tumbling tower block crafts, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing. I would love to have you here. As always, thanks for watching. My name is Sarah. I'm the Medicated Housewife, and crafting is my medication.